I've had a lot of questions from people asking about Section 21s, when they can use them, when they can't use them, what the procedure is, and if not, how do they go about issuing a Section 8 notice, what are the grounds available to them, and will it guarantee an eviction? The Section 21 was actually introduced under the Housing Act 1988 to end decades of regulated tenancies, which were actually introduced as a temporary measure during World War I in 1915, just to ensure that during the war people did not find themselves homeless. But as always, when the government intervenes, they normally make a mess of it, and this went on for decades until 1988. The reason that it was introduced was actually for positive reasons, because it was understood by the government at the time that a successful economy needed to have a mobile workforce, and that couldn't happen if people couldn't move from London to Manchester and rent somewhere for a year and then move to Bristol, for example. So that's how regulated the assured short hold tenancy was born, and that was the reason and the thinking behind it. But somewhere along the line, things went wrong. As the demand on housing increased, local authorities began to advise tenants badly. Namely, when Section 21s were issued, local authorities would then say to tenants to stay put until they were evicted by a bailiff. And if they were to leave before then, they would be making themselves voluntarily homeless, and the local authority would not help them. So basically, they were putting the tenants in a difficult position and exploiting that situation so that they could have grounds to refuse to help anyone who was decent enough to leave a property when they were asked to by a landlord. By doing this, the local authorities exacerbated the problem, because landlords became more and more picky about who they were going to rent to, so the problem accelerated. In 2015, under the Deregulation Act, the government brought in some other measures, ensuring that there were certain documents, including the gas safety certificate, the how to rent guide, and the energy performance certificate, were given to tenants before they moved into the property. Failure to do so would mean that you have lost the right to use a Section 21 notice forever. There is no coming back from that. Once that ship has sailed, it has gone forever, leaving you with Section 8 as your only option. However, as many landlords have found to their cost, issuing these documents before the tenant moved in could not really guarantee that they would find themselves not having their Section 21 notice contested, because if the tenants argued that they hadn't received it and the landlord couldn't prove that they had given these notices to the tenant, the judge more than likely would throw out your fast track Section 21 notice, which caused more problems, because you then had to go to a manual application. You'd probably have to pay your fee again, which has more than tripled in price over the last few years. And where there is an argument for a case, there can always be an argument against it, and the case drags on and costs more, and in the end the landlord could easily find that they are out of pocket by thousands of pounds. So there's quite a few conditions for issuing a Section 21 that you need to comply with, and I've detailed them all out in an article which I shall put a link to below. But if you fail to qualify to use a Section 21, then you need to move on to the Section 8, which is a completely different ballgame. The Section 8 has 17 different grounds for eviction, 8 of which are mandatory, meaning that if effectively the judge must grant an eviction order, and the other 9 are discretionary, and the judge is under no obligation to grant an eviction order. So even with the mandatory grounds, that does not guarantee that you will get an eviction. You probably will do eventually, but it could drag on for a long time. And under the discretionary grounds, even if it was your own home and you are an accidental landlord because you decided to rent your property out for a year while you moved somewhere else to work, you then return home and you want your property back, the judge doesn't have to agree with your application for a Section 8, which has left people actually homeless because they've not had access to their property, and they're not necessarily professional portfolio landlords. It's just people who happen to rent their home out because if they move somewhere else for work, they couldn't afford to pay for two properties. So you need to be very careful about ensuring that before you move a tenant in, that you have provided all of the documents and that you have evidence that they have been provided. What I do is I actually document them in a list and either get the tenant to sign for each one individually or sign across the whole lot over the top of the writing. So there is no question at a later date that they were not given these documents. And I then send a copy of that lease to the tenant to ensure that there are two identical copies signed in the same place, so there can be no argument. This, as you may be aware, I discovered to my cost when I had a tenant who made that very argument that they had not received documents, and it was an absolute minefield. I would recommend that you actually get professional advice. Sadly, many local solicitors are not really clued up on what to do once you move away from a fast track Section 21. The average solicitor wants to charge you hundreds of pounds to fill in a standard Section 21 fast track application, which they've done many times, and it literally is rubber stamped by the court and it comes back to them. Once there are any complications involved, many solicitors won't be able to, in all honesty, deal with this matter with authority. So this is where, if you are considering, if you're a landlord for the first time, join some sort of landlords association where you will have access to professional advice from solicitors who specialize in this matter. One further thing, once you are granted an eviction order by the court, be it Section 21 or be it under Section 8, that is not the end of the matter, because after that you need to then wait a period of 1 or 2 weeks. You then need to apply for an enforcement order. Once that is granted, you then need to find yourself a bailiff to conduct the eviction. And as many of you who have had to do that since the end of the ban on evictions last year, you will know that many bailiffs are booked up months in advance. And in the meantime, you have an eviction order on a tenant in your property that you can't do anything about until those bailiffs can enforce the eviction. And more often than not, because those tenants know they are going to be evicted, they've lost the case, there's nothing they can do, they probably won't be paying you in that time. One word of advice is, in the period where the enforcement order is granted, it is worth to tick the box and have your case transferred to the High Court. It will cost you, I believe, an extra £1,000, but nobody messes with a High Court sheriff, and they will normally be out in a matter of days. And it may hurt to pay that extra figure, but in the long run, it will actually save you money, and more importantly, it will save you a lot of stress. I hope this helps. As I said, I'll post a link to the article where I've written all of the grounds for everything. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact me or email me anytime.